Hi, this is Paul. I've probably had more frustration with this video than any video I've ever been trying to make. I'm trying to work the crossover between Jordan Peterson and the Critical Drinker and Jonathan Pageau, and it is there. For Peterson, meaning is the gyroscope within the secular frame whose clouds cover the stars. And so if you follow meaning, you have a better than average chance of bumping into truth, beauty, and goodness. For the Critical Drinker, it's satisfaction in stories. Again, that's a gyroscope. Now, Critical Drinker is sort of doing his thing to critique the powers that be in Hollywood and what he sees as the corruption of storytelling that's happening in far too many movies. That complaint will likely be dismissed by many, but I don't think that this is merely random or arbitrary. I think that in a Pageauian way, story has structure, and that structure relates to the world. One of the refrains that John Vervaeke has been repeating has been against nominalism. And if you ask John Vervaeke to define nominalism, he will say that nominalism is the assertion that there are not real relations out there in the world, that all relations are projected from us onto the world. Now, one might ask where, in fact, we derived the capacity to project relations onto the world if no such relations exist. In fact, the reality of relations, which we all assume to begin with, perhaps suggests that they are not in fact arbitrary, but are in fact real. And by real, I don't mean physical. I mean something beyond and behind the physical that gives physicality coherence. It is perhaps an analogy to the unusual matrix of constants that allow the universe to work. So I'm going to begin with Fry, because he begins his second lecture on the Bible and English literature with a pretty astounding statement. I hope I have the sound levels right. If I don't, please let me know.
Narrative sequences in the Bible that I was speaking of are of a type that make it very difficult to answer the question, are they histories or fictions?
That is a huge statement that he just made. I got a comment in the last video that I distract myself when I draw, and I draw poorly. And those things are both true. So I'm going to try to draw off camera to be a little bit more legible for you. I'll probably still do some scribbling because I can't help myself. When Northrop Frye says, well, let's have him say it again.
Narrative sequences in the Bible that I was speaking of are of a type that make it very difficult to answer the question, are they histories or fictions?
Why would that be? Well, partly because this fork here, as C.S. Lewis notes, came about after the Bible was written. That's a very difficult thing to think about. Also, the fork was accentuated by the modernist fundamentalist fight, where modernists basically said the Bible is all spirit, And fundamentalists said the Bible is all physics, or the Bible is wind, the Bible is spirit. Because again, before this fork, wind and spirit had the same word. And people could, well, what could they do? We don't know, because we can't go back and mind read them. Part of the reason that Northrop Frye says what he says about the text of the Bible is exactly this.
In fact, it might be said that what is distinctive, almost unique about the Bible, is the fact that that question cannot be directly answered at all. And
now, one might say, in looking at this diagram, well, that should be true of all ancient literature, but it isn't. You can read Julius Caesar's history of the conquest of Gaul, and, well, you might try and go back on it and find the wind, find the physicality, find what we call history, and take it apart from the other elements. But the Bible is uniquely in this category. What the Hebrew scribes did was foundational in terms of world history. And I would say foundational in terms of storytelling today.
I said last day that every sequence in words, just by virtue of the fact that it has a sequence, is a verbal structure in which the words have their own patterns and their own forms. It is impossible to describe anything with definitive accuracy in the outside world by means of words, because words are always forming their own self-contained patterns of subject and predicate and object.
Okay, what is he talking about there? He is basically saying that words belong to the upper register. They belong in some way to fiction, because words are sort of abstractions out, so you can't speak definitively about them in the way that Ian McGilchrist would say the left side of the brain imagines it can address the world. But that doesn't mean it relates unproductively. Let's jump to his third lecture.
Last day of a number of ups and downs in a chart that looked like the Loch Ness Monster of Israel.
And we'll get to that serpentine chart in a minute.
Rising to a certain ideal level and then dropping to a level of bondage or invasion or exile. And I suggested that the categories on top and the categories on the bottom are all metaphorically identical with one another, and that one has to understand the extent to which the Bible relies on metaphorical identification. Metaphor in the Bible is not an ornament of language. It is the controlling mode of thought. And
now, if you go to C.S. Lewis's Miracles, where he addresses some of these same dynamics, Lewis will make the point that all language is metaphor, and that's the relation between the upper and lower register.
Metaphor is a statement which grammatically reads, this is that. And as all statements that two things are the same thing while being two things are illogical, or rather anti-logical, we have to take that into consideration too as one of the important things about the Bible. It is not using the language of logic or predication. It is using a language which it has in common with poetry, but using it for a slightly different purpose. Now, I said that there was, first of all, a story at the beginning of the Bible, according to which Adam was placed in the Garden of Eden and was then thrown out of it into the wilderness.
Okay, we'll get back to that. A while ago, I treated Like Stories of Old, which is a beautiful channel, series that they did on stories versus realities. And they took, in a sense, the nominalist position.
Now that we've discussed how most popular stories, unlike our own lives, unfold according to an archetypal structure in which every character trait that was shown, every effort that is made, every event that is experienced, every victory, every defeat, every step along the way, tends to be imbued with an inherent sense of purpose, we can also see what makes them so appealing. It's obviously comforting to believe that our lives too are ordered according to meaningful principles, that everything we do is significant to a greater purpose, and that it will all work out in the end. But stories are ordered from the beginning in a way that we can only do by virtue of hindsight, by looking back afterwards and trying to make sense of everything that came prior.
So not only is it time, it's also, again, register. Because as Fry notes, language is completely connected to this. Metaphor is completely connected to this. And I would assert that, in a sense, if you want to give up story, you're probably going to be giving up language. Vervaeke continually remarks about the difficulty that we have with grammar because, in some ways, language locks us into these things. Now back to Fry. I got to make sure I have the correct lecture.
And they are continually shaping reality into what are essentially grammatical fictions. And I suggested that it doesn't matter whether a sequence of words is called a history or a story, that is, whether it is intended to follow a sequence of actual events or not, as far as its verbal shape is concerned. It'll be equally mythical in either case.
Now, what does he mean by that? It'll be equally mythical. That whether it's a history, which, again, a la the division, or if it's a story, it will be equally mythical in terms of how it draws us into the life we wish to see. Now, let's see. Nope, not that one. The critical drinker is not trying to connect metaphysics at all here. He's just basically saying good story. And he's saying good story to us gives us a sense of connectedness to the broader world. It is fundamentally religious in that storied sense. And he continues to contrast bad writing and good writing. And bad writing does not give us a sense of myth. Good writing does.
End of the character scale, Walter an authoritarian shield. At the other end of the character scale, Walter White is one of the greatest examples of character development in modern entertainment. He starts out as a mild-mannered and decent man that's been let down and taken advantage of his whole life. When he's given a terminal diagnosis, he's reluctantly drawn into a world of crime and murder, forced to resort to increasingly ruthless and morally reprehensible acts to protect his hard-won gains.
Now, if we give Like Stories of Old its nominalist fair treatment, we could say that Walter, within the story, does not have a lot of consciousness about the bigger development, the story arc that is happening. And rightly so. When we're in the middle of our lives, we don't have that. That's very much first personal. And to a certain degree, a story is third personal. because we see the entire arc. If you go back to my video about the consciousness of our neurons versus the consciousness of the network of neurons, let's say, versus the consciousness of all the networked neurons, people looking at the screen in the theater, we're leveling up here in terms of recognition of story or pattern or looking for myth.
Unfortunately, his newfound power and respect starts to go to his head, ultimately warping him into something completely unrecognizable from the man he once was. I could go on and on about this, but the point is that each of these characters became popular not because of what they were, but how they were written and portrayed. They were each well developed.
Okay, how they were written and portrayed, and saying, okay, that's right. The mythology is in that way inherent in the writing. Good writing will lead to good mythology, effective mythology, something that in the Critical Drinker's satisfaction theory of gyroscopic navigation will lead us to, well, to where? Now, he's not trying to make those connections there, but by virtue of the fact that what he's dealing with are the elements of the folk religion of our culture, what's happening underneath this fight is, in fact, a very religious fight.
Well written and well acted. An audience responded to those things. Most fundamental of all, their writers respected them, which is the first and most vital step towards making the audience respect them.
Okay, now that respect he's talking about, I think, is absolutely vital, because even though there will often be fantastical elements, there has to be a certain degree of cohesion, both within certain rules in the physical world, but also rules in, now I'm doing it again. See, I'm doing it again. In the timeline of the narrative, even contained within that world. And so when the Critical Drinker goes and pokes at plot holes in many movies, these are the kinds of things he pokes at. Because, in fact, as Fry says, there has to be coherence within, let's say, the fictional spirit realm. There are always constraints. There has to be a degree of coherence between, and I think I still have some of these slides left of, there has to be a degree of coherence between, this is the egregore video, between the view from above and the first personal going through.
Because, believe it or not, audiences aren't as dumb as modern Hollywood might think. Yeah,
How often have we heard Jordan Peterson make that claim?
believe it or not, audiences aren't as dumb as modern Hollywood might think. Yeah, they can't always articulate why they like a certain character, or how smart writing can convey a lot of information in a short time, or make complex character development seem easy, or...
And how powerful, now he's a writer, so he's always focusing more on the writing aspect, which more often than not is the failure of a movie. You can have a movie with no special effect, bad special effects, bad acting, but if you have good writing, the good writing is the foundation of the art.
how a good script can depict a flawed person that makes mistakes while still maintaining respect for them, but they
Again, respect is this overall coherence.
know it's a flawed person that makes mistakes while still maintaining respect for them, but they know it when they see it, and more important, they know when it's missing. Which brings...
They know it when they see it, and they know when it's missing. They might not be able to do it themselves, but they recognize it, and they respond to it one way or another.
But we notice that any emphasis on shape or structure or pattern or form always throws a verbal narrative into the direction we call mythical rather than historical.
And this is to, in a sense, give, like stories of old, their due, because we recognize in our lives the one thing seems to flow after another, but the mythical is, in fact, the making sense, the sense-making, the making sense of the story by accumulating all of the pieces, looking at the patterns, and walking through in that way.
To give you an example from the book of Judges. The book of Judges is a sequence of stories about leaders who were originally tribal leaders, but they've been edited to present the appearance of a united Israel going through a series of disasters and restorations.
Okay, now, Israel, from a purely nominalist point of view, does not exist. Well, what do you mean? Because Israel would be a category upon which a group of people are labeled, recognized, out of which a coherent story could be formed. All right? Now, in all of these things, there are, of course, value judgments. And so stories cannot be told without value judgments. Value hierarchies will create. And so the story of the book of Judges is about leaders over people. Now, all of those people in the midst of it recognize themselves. There's identity. There's niches, and we're going to talk about niches in a few minutes. And that's vital to the construction of all of this.
That's the appearance of a united Israel going through a series of disasters and restorations. The actual heroes are different each time: Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, Samuel, and the stories told about them naturally differ in content, but they're all set inside a similar framework. And that framework is Israel deserts its God, the result is disaster. An enemy moves in, conquers the country or invades it. The Israelites think better of their infidelity, turn back to their God again. A deliverer or a judge is sent, and he brings them back to a position roughly where they were before. Now that gives you a narrative shape or pattern, which you would get either in a history or in a work of literature. It wouldn't matter. You'd still have that. And the particular shape that you get is roughly a U shape. That is.
Now, if you listen to my conversation with Yosef, the modernist Orthodox Jew that appeared, today is Tuesday when I'm recording this, that appeared Tuesday morning, you'll hear we had a little bit of conversation about this. And part of the reason I'm glad he gave me the green light to release that is because, I want to take his fair questions into account with this. Let's see if the whiteboard has, in fact, refreshed to bring in the clean one. It has. Good. So he's talking about this U shape, and, well, I am going to commit the sin here and do what I said I wasn't going to do, where you have Israel begins, in a sense, in a state of normalcy from which it descends because a new threat came into the land. Now, that could be a new pharaoh came into Egypt, and we'll be getting to Exodus at some point. I'm going to continue to look at Jordan Peterson's conversation with Brett Weinstein because that touches with that. Or the Midianites or the Philistines, there's some threat that comes, and Israel is being oppressed, and then they finally cry out to God, and God brings in a judge to deliver them, and that judge, in fact, many of the judges in the book of Judges are flawed characters, deeply flawed in many cases, and through the judge, God delivers them. Now, part of my critique of what we're going to call with this hero's journey is that the Bible has some unique characteristics which are almost always covered up in contemporary storytelling. And this does, in fact, in some ways get into God number one and God number two. Because God works through the judges, even though the judges are themselves significantly flawed, but yet God works through them anyway and achieves the ends that he desires from them. And the judge, through God's help, delivers Israel. Israel, because over here they turned back to God in terms of their prayers, and then the situation is restored.
You begin with infidelity. The result is bondage. Then there is the return. Then there is the deliverer or judge. Now that is the general shape of the typical story told in the book of Judges. And that U-shaped pattern is the typical shape of the structure we know as comedy. If you look at comedy, you find that a situation is presented in front of you which gradually becomes more ominous and threatening.
If you go back to John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, you can get into a problem. Jordan Peterson says, we don't see objects primarily, we see opportunities and obstacles. Problems come in, and the U-shaped story is about the resolution of a problem.
And foreboding of disaster to the characters that you are sympathetic with. But then there's a kind of gimmick or sudden shift in the plot. And eventually it moves towards a happy ending where everybody gets married, and the hero and heroine's real life is assumed to begin after the play is over, which is why the heroes and heroines of so many comedies are in fact rather dull people, and the main character interest is thrown on the blocking characters, like the parents who forbidden them to marry or something of that kind.
Now, the Critical Drinker had an excellent video on why villains have gotten so bad, and I might treat that video in more detail later. But it's a good video. If we look at how, in fact, this structure relates to, so you have a U-shaped structure, as he talked about, and how this relates to, let's say, the hero's journey, which is circular, there certainly is an element about it. Now, part of what Fry said was that the villain, who is in many ways outside the hero's journey. Okay, so here's the hero's journey. You have the call to adventure, you have the supernatural aid, you have the threshold, you have the helper, the mentor, temptation, the abyss, death and rebirth, transformation, atonement, return. And we're setting that in some ways next to the U-shaped story. And so in some ways you can see how the hero's journey can sort of fit into the U-shaped story. But as I said, in biblical stories, in almost every case, the hero is God, and the instantiation of God's work is in fact a flawed character and a flawed hero. So even within the biblical corpus, while we can look at heroes' journeys, let's say in the book of Judges, Samson, In most cases, it's the environment around that is transformed, or in fact, as we get into the Peterson video, the niche, or the niche, as Peterson says, that is transformed.
Now that is also the containing narrative shape of the Bible, because the mythical shape of the Bible, if you read it from beginning to end, is a comic shape.
Now he's talking about the Christian Bible, and that's something that Joseph and I talked about, that I think, in fact, the shape of the Christian Bible is, in fact, of course, a religious assertion, and some of the differences in shape, if you have the Hebrew Scriptures and not the New Testament, as Christians call them, the book itself will have a different shape. And those two different shapes are reflected in the two religions, and I think those two different shapes will have profound implications the further you go down.
It's a story in which man is placed in a state of nature from which he falls. And the word fall is something which this diagram indicates. And then at the end of the story, he is restored to the things that he had at the beginning. There is the story of Israel, and Israel in the Old Testament is restored at the end of history according to the way the prophets see that history. The Christian Bible is focused more on the story of Adam, who represents mankind falling from a state of integration with nature into a state where he is alienated from nature. And in symbolic terms, what Adam loses is the tree and the water of life. Those are the images that we'll look at in more detail later.
Now, a nominalist critique could be that, well, those are arbitrary projections of us onto the story. In many ways, a lot of this was underneath the conversation that Jordan Peterson had with Sam Harris in Vancouver, and then Ireland and the UK and London. Is it in fact arbitrary? Is it merely a projection? Because Sam Harris liked to say you can project anything on it. The question is going to be in terms of the coherence as it is all pulled together. If we look back again at this diagram here, it'll be both the coherence within the story and the register coherence, which is in many ways the meeting between heaven and earth.
And on practically the first page of the Bible, you are told that Adam loses the tree and the water of life in the Garden of Eden. On practically the last page of the Bible, in the last chapter of the book of Revelation, the prophet has a vision of the tree and the water of life restored to man. Now that affinity between the structure of the Bible and the structure of the Christian myth which is founded on it, the affinity between that structure and the structure of comedy has been recognized for many centuries, and is the reason why Dante called his vision of hell and purgatory and heaven a commedia. We owe our great tragedies very largely to the Greek tradition, which has a different outlook, which Professor Stobel will be explaining in the other half of this course. And we notice that the Bible is not very close to tragedy. When it deals with disaster, its point of view is ironic rather than tragic. because, well, there are many reasons which we'll come to later. The main ones are that in the typical tragedy, you have a hero who suggests certain qualities which are superhuman, and the Bible recognizes no such hero except for Jesus himself. The crucifixion would be the one genuine tragic form in the Bible, but that, of course, is an episode in a containing comedy.
Now, we should be fair to the structure of these stories. Now, what Fry is going to diagram out, at least in terms of the Christian scriptures, which, say, begin at a good garden, and then you might say that the Hebrew scriptures sort of stop here. Now, of course, there are many waves, and there are subwaves, and there are nested waves. I got to get this. And, of course, so you have Genesis here, and then you have Revelation here, the new heaven and new earth, and it's a return. There is, in some ways, a spiral dynamic here in the Bible. It's not simply linear. You don't end up exactly back here. There's also directionality going this way, and there are different highs and lows as the story goes along.
And this U-shaped pattern of loss and return and deliverance and ending with something of what you had before is found all the way through the Bible. It's not only the containing form, but you find it in many parts of the Bible that have nothing to do with history. It is, for example, a containing form of the story of Job, who is in a state of prosperity, loses everything he has, and at the end of the story is restored to what he had before. It is also the containing shape of Jesus' parable of the prodigal son, and it's perhaps interesting to notice that the prodigal son is the only version we have in the Bible of these loss and return stories where the decision to return is a voluntary act of the chief character himself.
Now, those of you who have in the past heard my rendering of the prodigal son, which I get from Kenneth Bailey, who's an American or a UK scholar who worked in Lebanon for years, I differ with Fry on that point, because I think Bailey is correct that what the prodigal son leaves the far-off country with is in fact the words of Pharaoh, and that the father saves him not because of himself, but in some ways despite himself. Call me a Calvinist, but the exception that Northrop Frye points to, I think, in fact, is not an exception. I think the story of the prodigal son fits into the other stories, too. Now, well, let's see where this goes.
In Jesus' parable, the prodigal son says he is going to go back to where he was before.
But he's going with Pharaoh's words.
That's the only example. All the others depend on a human confession of helplessness and a divine intervention. Now
that's a significant difference between the Bible and what we tend to think about as the hero's journey. I think the telling of the hero's journey is flawed in many respects because of the individualism. Because the appropriation of the hero's journey here tends to be that, well, the hero saves himself, and the hero is saved for himself. Or the hero is saved for the gold or for the girl. Now, the hero often gets the gold and gets the girl, but what the hero actually saves, as in the Book of Judges, is the context or the environment. The hero transforms the niches from one thing to another. Okay, I want to bring in this video with Jordan Peterson and the Weinsteins, and they're discussing their book, and they're discussing the human niche, and they're discussing it with respect to the hero's journey, which I think is very interesting.
The new landscape that sits in front of us, and you also discuss that in relationship to the human niche. And so one of the issues you confront very early in the book is this notion of hyper-novelty. And I mean, I've been very ill for a long time, and so I've sort of woken back up, and I have all this new electronic stuff around me that I don't know how to use. And it can do so much, but it's very, very hard to figure out how to make it work. And
there is a ton of repetition in this video from his first video with Brett Weinstein. And there are moments when Peterson's a little bit manic in this video. I found that quite interesting.
I know perfectly well that problem is not going away. Like, it's going to be twice as bad in a year and twice as bad again a year after that. And so what's this idea of hyper-novelty in more detail?
Well, at one level, and I'll let Brett continue on after I answer, but at one level, the book is an invitation to consider trade-offs in all things, to recognize that so much of modernity has been amazing for humanity and has given us the level of comfort and productivity and connection that we have. And that is, we do not forget that when we also point out that the amazing rate of change that we ourselves have created is itself deranging us and making it very difficult to understand how to be human and how to remember how to be human.
So I would add...
Okay, so let's slow this down a little bit. So we have a context and we have a problem. And the problem is the rate of change that human beings are in fact... Come on. Human beings are, in fact, conditioned by our environment. We adapt to our environment. If the environment changes too rapidly, we lose our capacity. Let's hear her continue to explain what niche is.
Add that the fact of novel technology, of course, exists in obvious forms in the types of devices that you're referring to, but it also fits well with many other things, novel molecules that we encounter, novel ways of socially interacting. And the problem is that although we are the most flexible creature that selection has ever produced, our level of flexibility is not up to a rate of change where we literally do not mature into the same world in which we were born. By the time we become adults, we live in some different context. And what this means,
which is a pretty amazing thing, and he's right. I was born in the mid-60s. The world from the mid-60s to the mid-80s changed a lot.
At an intuitive level, is that we do not know what to do. Our intuitions are badly tuned for the kinds of things that we encounter. And this is made particularly bad in the context of markets, where our intuitions can be hijacked to get us to engage in behavior that benefits the people producing the content, but at some cost to us.
Now, I want to, just because I did the video early this week about these spiritual realities, markets are in some ways egregores, as B.J. Campbell called them. They are these agents that are stronger than we are, that in some ways have them in our grip. Now, to what degree, what other things can we talk about the agency of these markets? That goes beyond this video, but I just wanted to point that out, that even when we talk about markets, we're talking about collective entities that are above and beyond us. We try to manage them. In fact, that's what economics is about. That's what the Federal Reserve is about. That's what all of this economic punditry is about. But We do not control them. We participate in them. We can benefit from them, or we can be its victim. And so in many ways, something like this is critical for the setting up of hero's journey type things or heroic elements.
We have to become aware of this hazard, and we have to learn to apply the brakes to it. It's not that progress is bad. Progress is often tremendous, but it almost always comes with important unintended consequences, and being aware of them is an important feature.
Right.
Now, applying the brakes to progress, what type of thing is progress? Is it something we have control over? Is it something we are projecting onto the world? See, this is where nominalism breaks down, because people who would love to be nominalist really can't hold to it very long. Because right away, other elements will come into their life and say, is the market simply a projection in your world? Is progress simply a projection in your world? Now, one might say that, yeah, there is an element to which we have to selectively look at items and apply value judgments to them in order to see progress. But whether it's progress, decadence, stagnation, or corruption, very few of us would just simply wave our hand and say, these are all figments of our imagination. I will go along in my life not caring about any of those things. What we have in this conversation is a group of people who are deeply concerned about all such, I don't like the term hyperobjects, egregores. They're all such principalities and powers, and trying to figure out what to do about them, what to do with them, and how to navigate a world that is in fact full of them. And we've just only mentioned two.
So that's a permanent part, in some sense, of the proper political debate, right? And so you think we face a horizon of genuinely and truly unpredictable change. No one knows what's going to happen in the next 10 years at all. And so the liberal types who think more, loosely and with more associations and more...
Even his skepticism about predictions says everything about the way that the community will, in fact, at some point come to agreement around predictions. Now, again, if you read history, if you read old newspapers, you'll notice that these agreements continue to change back and forth one at a time, but that, in fact, they emerge and we deal with them and we talk about them. There should be no skepticism about that.
Creatively, they're going to produce solutions, hypothetically, to those unpredictable problems. But the conservative types are always saying, yeah, but be careful, guys, because your damn solutions might be worse than the problem. And you can never say that one side of that argument has the floor properly. You never know, because it really is unpredictable. And so if that debate between the liberals and the conservatives isn't allowed to exist in an untrammeled manner, we actually interfere with our fundamental problem-solving ability, both individually and collectively.
Now, before he goes on to another thing, let me pull up this. Because, again, back to the previous video that I made, these things wish to have us. They wish to possess us. Whether they're ideologies or religions or markets. Markets certainly wish to possess us. Marketers certainly wish to possess us. Marketing is about the capture of human beings within their egregores. That's what the game is about.
When you talked about our niche being niche switching, that's part of the reason that I thought that the hero story in some sense is at the top of the value hierarchy is because the hero story is about niche switching. Mm-hmm. It's about the transformation of viewpoints. And so, what should all viewpoints be subject to? The transformation of viewpoints when necessary. It's something like that. And I thought that dovetailed with this idea of niche switching being one of human beings' prime. So maybe you could explain that niche.
Now this is where I think, again, the biblical frame of reference is superior to what Peterson sort of just laid out. Now, the hero in this process will certainly undergo a particular transformation, But the hero works, in fact, in the context of a much more communitarian question. And let's say you have Israel under the grip of the Philistines. Oops, I'm slowing things down again with my bad writing. Oh, and I've got to keep up here too. And here you have David, king over Israel. That's the transformation. You see transformation of the hero, but you see transformation of the hero's community. And so we watch these with, well, questions of participation. Now, we might not be the central hero because the story isn't about us. And now it makes a world of sense in the Bible that actually the mover of all of this is, in fact, God. Well, right away we have God number one, God number two. Well, what do I mean by that? Certainly God is being agentic in moving all of this stuff with design because, of course, this story will be connected with a far larger, bigger story with many more peaks and valleys along the way, and there'll be new heroes in new niches that come along and bring the story forward, and there'll be many other players, but of course, it is in fact the God of the story that is giving this story directionality and moving it towards a telos. And so I like what they're talking about in terms of a niche, but it isn't the hero alone that undergoes the transformation. The hero, in fact, brings the world into a different place. Now, if we, let's say that the hero, as Fry says, is Jesus, well, what does Jesus do? Jesus brings us from old earth, decay, to new earth. And that's the transformation. But then Jesus, of course, this fractals down, gets involved in the transformation of individuals. And that's basically how the Christian story works. Let's go back to the drinker.
Person that makes mistakes while still maintaining respect for them, but they know it.
Now, there you have this balance. They make mistakes, but there's respect. Well, you can do that because, of course, in the context of this story, the individuals are being used by the larger forces for good or for ill, and of course, these will scale up.
But when they see it, and more important, they know when it's missing. Which brings me back around to Luke Skywalker, the subject of this article. See, describing Luke from the original trilogy as a glorified Boy Scout is ridiculously reductive and patronising towards both the character and the reader, which is pretty much what you'd expect from modern clickbait journalism, so whatever. The reality is that Luke is a classic example of the reluctant hero who gets swept off on a journey, a hero's journey, if you will.
And he's, of course, going to save the galaxy, won't he?
No way! When he starts out, he's young and idealistic and inexperienced, just a farm boy living a sheltered life at the ass end of nowhere, who harbours romantic notions of adventure and excitements. His first steps out into the wider world are tentative and faltering. He makes mistakes, lacks the knowledge needed to navigate a dangerous world, and gets himself into situations he can't handle. And it takes the guidance of an older and wiser mentor to get him started on the right path. The first time he gets into a fight, or operates a gun turret, or holds a lightsaber, or flies an X-Wing, he's kind of clumsy and awkward, and he has to learn fast to stay alive, growing in skill and confidence along the way. His actions throughout the movie are entirely consistent with what we know about his personality and backgrounds. By the second film, he's started to expand his powers, but his impetuous nature and emotional attachment to his friends causes him to rush into a fight he isn't ready for, and he pays a heavy price for his mistake. But by the final film, he's learned to temper his power with wisdom, compassion, and restraint. In short, he's completed the hero's journey, and at every stage of...
But, again, he's completed the hero's journey, and we tend to look at him and identify him with him. That's how these stories work. We live into the story. But the key thing for that hero is that the context, he changes the niche. And that is humanity's huge power. We change the niche. The dog doesn't just stay a dog. The dog will thrive or not thrive depending on the niche. The dog might dig a little burrow, but it's, again, the dog's at this lower agency. The dog might dig a little burrow, but doesn't fundamentally change the niche. He doesn't intentionally change the niche.
That journey, the script manages to stay respectful to his character. It never has him do stupid shit for a quick laugh, or makes him weak and incapable just to elevate another character, or has him make choices that are totally inconsistent with everything he's done before, just to fit the demands of the story. People bonded with Luke because fundamentally he was a well-written character played by a good actor who went on an interesting and exciting journey, ultimately becoming a stronger and wiser man as a result. A character whose writer very much respected and cared for him. So as you can imagine, it was a bit of a kick in the nuts to see him living as a broken, defeated, bitter, cynical loser in The Last Jedi.
Okay, now we're going to have to talk to some of the difficulties in continuation of this pattern. So here we have the hero who has in fact transformed the niche, and now we want to visit the hero again. And we want to know, will the old hero do again what the new hero did? Because we also want to see development in the character of the hero from one to the next. As I noted in my conversation with Joseph, well, David has more of a tragic arc. Because the tragic arc, sort of like Walter White, you begin low, you reach a high point, and then you end low. Now with David, he has the crisis with Bathsheba. The child dies. He repents. He turns it around. The battle is won. So there's a tiny little arc in there. But what you see in the Bible, again, are all of these ups and downs, and they're very much nested in. But the crisis is that we die and decay. So can David stay the eternal hero? Now, of course, in Christianity, that gets a little bit easier because, and this is why Jesus is so archetypal, that Jesus is, he reigns on his Father's throne from heaven. He is not subject to decay after his resurrection. He is Lord, and when he returns, he will come to judge the living and the dead. That's how these things are dealt with. But now, it's difficult for Hollywood to figure out how to deal with these heroes. Now, often what you get is a replacement, and in some ways you get that in the story of Israel when, at the end of all of this crisis, you're going to have yet another mini civil war, but then Solomon is going to come and you'll have the return of the king. And so a lot of the questions here has to do with, well, which exact element are we paying attention to when we're framing the story? So if you frame the story of David like this, you have a tragedy. But if you frame the story like this, after Solomon, you get a comedy. And again, life is like that, but these are the issues that storytellers have to deal with. Now, part of what I think Hollywood is struggling with is, in fact, the age of decay. What can we do with these characters? And basically, Critical Drinker says, leave them alone. Let them become. There's a little Mexican restaurant near here that when Rebel Wisdom came through a few years ago and shocked my church by taking video of me on a Sunday, I took them out to lunch I thought I'd give them some, they're from the UK. How much good Mexican food can they really get? So I took them to a favorite little place of mine. It's called Los Inmortales. And what they have is usually actors who have killed themselves in the prime of life up on their walls. A little bit of irony in that. But what we're bumping into is, I think, our inability, quite frankly, to believe the entire story and to just abstract out the little bits of it and what happens when they get old.
Entirely defined by his determination to keep going, no matter how hard life hit him. To always go one more round. It was literally the driving force behind every single movie, and now it's forgotten about so that Rocky can become some kind of pathetic charity case for Adonis to help out. The common factor in all of these examples is the very obvious attempt to undermine and reverse the very traits that made these heroic characters so compelling in the first place.
Now, what he puts his finger on here is key, that there's a change of traits going on, and that's what he keeps pointing out. There's substandard writing. There's some also good writing, but there's substandard writing. There's a change of traits, but then there's also really an address of history. And whereas in the biblical corpus, well, let's let him finish.
Luke's optimism and bravery has been turned into pessimism and passivity. Sarah's maternal protectiveness has been replaced with bitterness and resentment at the role that was thrust upon her. Rocky's relentless drive and positivity has given way to despair and defeatism. All of these characters that used to exemplify the most positive aspects of human nature have been twisted and warped into obscene parodies of themselves, tarnishing not just who they are now, but who they once were as well. All of this has been done without a shred of remorse or regret, and for fucking what? So you can replace them with your cheap plastic imitations, strong-arm audiences into liking the flavourless slop that you've managed to serve up, because you know you can never reach the same heights as them, so the only way to surpass them is to tear them down to your mediocre level? For me, this is one of the most disgusting hallmarks of modern screenwriting, the denigration of the past in a desperate attempt to elevate the present, the bastardization of other people's work to service your own. Or as one of my subscribers so aptly put it, any fucking idiot with a hammer can destroy in minutes what a master artist took years to craft. Well, it
I think there are...
turns out that Hollywood today is short of neither idiots nor hammers. The only question now is how many more works of art will they end up destroying?
I think there's something deeper going on here too. I've often said that the Christian religion is progressive, and you can see the progress overall in a story like this and with a story structure like this. Part of what happened in the modern period is the story doesn't start here. The story starts down here. And part of what has happened in an truly ardent progressivism is that you can allow zero respect of the past. The present and the future must always be better by virtue of the value hierarchy that you are judging the entire scheme with. So, for example, well, this is what has happened with racism, and you can just fill in all of the other elements. Were our ancestors racist? Yes. Did racism in fact go all the way to the beginning? Well, probably not. Now, to the degree that racism is correlated to tribal preference, well, then you'd have a very different arc. But part of what the critical drinker is obviously pointing at is the new woke religion. And so underneath all of this, you have a woke religion, but behind it are real questions as to whether or not you had a heaven and earth basic structure of the story to begin with. Cosmology matters, and it impacts our imagination. Now, this is the basic structure of a tragedy, and this seems to be the basic structure of the contemporary story, the contemporary cosmology about humanity. Things start very primitive and tribal, and again, you've got your moral stories all all brought into this, and we somehow want to reach for a peak that is going to get us up here, but we know that at some point the sun will lose its ability to give warmth. Maybe we'll get to other stars, but at some point you'll have the heat death of the universe and all will be gone. Now, obviously there are others who might tinker with this, but basically deep down the world is a tragedy. And so to meet Luke Skywalker here and then find him at an old age, well, this is where we're heading. So instead you take a new arc and you try to interrupt it, but very quickly you're going to have comparisons in the storytelling quality between those others, and you're also going to have comparisons with a value hierarchy and to judge the elements of the story by that value hierarchy. Now here again, Peterson repeats a story that he told in the previous Brett Weinstein conversation.
My granddaughter, she watched Pocahontas a lot, and she had a Pocahontas doll, and she insisted for about a year and a half when she was, I think, 3, that she was if you asked her if she was Pocahontas or Ellie, she has 2 names, Ellie or Scarlet, she would insist that she was Pocahontas for a long time. And I thought that was remarkable, that she'd caught something out of that movie that attracted her so much that she was trying to embody that spirit. And well, that is the point of these sorts of animated movies, is to put that spirit forward.
Well, exactly.
But it was remarkable how committed she was. And if you think about that, over a year at that developmental stage, she's not Pocahontas anymore, by the way. But
she's already looking to participate in the hero's journey, because the hero is a hero by virtue of all of the other people around and the ability to transform a niche and rescue a niche.
But I tested it for a long time, and so that play, that's really deep. That's a really deep phenomenon. So,
and it gets to the human imperative to create story, to create meaning through narrative. And, there is, we've talked about this a little bit, there is not, the hero's journey is extraordinary and universal. And in modernity, I think it can almost just as easily apply to many females' journeys, but there aren't as many universal stories for girls and women. And so,
Beauty and the Beast is pretty good. I think it's the best Disney animation.
I think in many respects, the rom-com is a feminine version of the hero's journey.
Film, and like Beauty's really smart because she doesn't pick Gaston. He's got all the markers, right?
Right.
She actually wants a beast who can be civilized.
That's right.
And he's the one advantage that Gaston is all persona, so he's all the fake bowerbird. Now
how many times have we seen the beast who can be civilized in a rom-com or a romance? All the time.
A big guy and all that, but even that's fake. But and she's wise because she doesn't fall for the status markers, and he's completely nonplussed by this because he's devoted his whole life to just developing the status markers. And so I think it's Beauty and the Beast is there's a hero's journey in that's very deep. And some of these fairy tales, some of them have been traced back like 12 to 13,000 years. And so if it's that old, it's like 100,000 years.
Right.
Right. But this actually goes to a point that you and I have been dancing around forever, Jordan, which is the point about to what level are these very ancient things effectively timeless, and to what level are these things in need of change because we now face an environment for which they were not built. And so the hero's journey, I would argue, just painting with a broad brush, the hero's journey is timeless. What does the hero's journey look like? Well, it can look like Odysseus, or it can look like the Fellowship of the Ring, right? Those are very different versions of the hero's journey. And in fact, at the moment, one of the things that we need are stories that are not built by the market to fill some need, but that actually reflect the transition in what males and females do in the world. That in some sense, one of the positive things that has flown from birth control is that women, because they can now
let's pause before we get into the birth control business. But what's interesting here is that Brett always makes this point, but he doesn't take out the hero's journey. Partly because if you look at Brett's entire mission, he and his wife are on a hero's journey. What are they trying to do? You can chart their evergreen journey, and they're trying to save the niche. They're trying to save the world. And so he might say, well, all these things change. Well, apparently the hero's journey doesn't change. And so some things do change, some things don't change. Have to figure out what they do. But notice the structure of his thinking and his mission and the life he's living out and acting out hasn't changed at all. Elements change in the stories, but the structures are far more enduring.
Engage in family planning that works are free to compete with men in every realm that isn't physical.
Yeah, well, one question we're wrestling with is, well, are women just men then?
They are not.
Right, since the birth control pill. Well, but they are in some way, which is just what you said. They're way more like men than they were before 1950.
We are freed
because
from some
they
of
have
the
control.
constraints.
Yes, exactly. And so part of what we are trying to sort out in our culture is, well,
Grim Grizz is going to jump all over this point.
to what degree are they just men, or better men even? I mean, look what's happening to university enrollment, for example. And so we don't know. And that issue of universality. So a student once asked me in one of my classes at Harvard, it's like, well, if these stories are archetypal, why don't we just tell the same story over and over? Like exactly the same story. Mm. And I thought, that's a really good question. And then I thought, well, there's actually an answer to that in Christian symbolism. So one of the things that's really strange about Christian thinking is, well, there's God, so he's the sum of all good. Very abstract, though. Maybe he's a father, but he's way out there, and who knows what to do with him. But he's really abstract. Well, you have to take that abstraction and make it concrete. You have to make it embodied, right? You have to make it incarnated. And so I'm speaking psychologically about the story, not religiously. So to bridge that gap between the ideal image, which is archetypal and universal, and the particularity, the way the Christian imagination solved that problem was to say, well, that ideal was embodied in a particular time and place, which seems extremely arbitrary. But that's us, right? Because we are arbitrary embodiments of that, whatever that abstract humanity is. And we have to particularize the universal to our time and place. And that's why we need new storytellers all the time.
Right. You need new storytellers, and you need effectively a process of selection. It may or may not be affecting the storytellers, but it affects which stories resonate. And so a perfect example of what we do instead of telling the same story over and over.
And the market will be involved in that.
Again, is we tell a story in a way that is relevant to the current moment.
Yes,
right. The allegory of the cave is the perfect example of this, right? The Matrix is the allegory of the cave. Arguably, the Truman Show is the allegory of the cave. And the point is, there are ways in which this needs to be, we probably need an updated version of 1984 because we're living it again. And apparently 1984 isn't good enough to get us to recognize that at a level that will stop. Right. So in any case, there is a sort of need, and actually maybe this is the way this intersects with the book, is hypernovelty is the out of control process by which the acceleration of change outstrips the capacity.
Out of control? Out of whose control?
To adapt. That suggests that the pace...
What's interesting about that is he almost presupposes that there was a time not long ago before hypernovelty that we were in control. Were we?
At which the stories that we need must be updated is accelerating and probably too fast for us to get those stories.
Well, it's something. Here's something that's worth thinking about too in that regard. Okay, so what drives innovation in computer hardware? It's the attempt to tell stories to portray stories realistically, because that's the most technically demanding. And I mean this economically. I've talked to people who've designed these chips. Why do we need more and more powerful chips given that our computers are already too fast for us? It's like, well, we keep building these virtual worlds, and we build them because narratives, think about the game market, are so unbelievably compelling, and that provides the economic rationale for making our machines more and more intelligent. And so we
and the quality that we judge of these stories, again, is not so much whether they're valued on novelty, but whether they're valued in how they connect up with, well, what we had before, right here. That's how we judge their value.
We are hyper motivated to solve that problem in some real sense. Now, how successful that is, that's a whole different issue. But, you know, it's worth taking seriously. After all, we've all been told that politics is downstream from culture. So
I certainly like your point about it's the desire for the realism in the narratives that's actually driving technological process. Although if you complete that story at the moment, it may be alchemy, right? It's the mining of digital gold that is actually driving the hardware. It's in fact,
yeah. Well, that's a very strange thing too.
It's
yes,
a very
in all
odd
sorts
change.
Of ways.
Yeah,
yeah. It certainly is, and God only knows how revolutionary that is.
Yeah.
So I talk to a lot of the Bitcoin thinkers now, and I have a better sense of what it is. And I can't believe how smart the person was that made it. It's really, and the story is just beyond belief. This guy pops up, he makes this thing, he disappears. No one even knows who he is for sure. It's like, who could make that up?
Right. If he's even a person.
Well, and what I'm trying to do. Yeah. If he's even.
And again, as my conversation with Yosef, we're going to have to talk a lot more about persons, because clearly what's coming up on the frontier is the definition of persons. And as we're talking about these spiritual agents, that some of which arise from us, some of which we reinstantiate because they have been with us before.
Even a person, I'm trying to update our understanding of stories, that rather than the stories themselves, I suppose, and also to point out how important they are. That hero archetype, I really do think that that's the story of niche switching, right? Because and
I'd say not niche switching, it's niche transformation. You not only bring your community to a new niche, but you transform the new niche or the old niche into the new niche.
This is why I want to do a series on Exodus. And I really like Exodus. And you think about it in terms of a story about adaptations to niches. Okay, so an old adaptation gets tyrannical. It gets cast in stone. That's Egypt. It's all stone symbolism. It worked once, but now it doesn't. Well, that's an adaptation because the niche keeps changing underneath it. Okay, so then you have to switch the adaptation. Well, Moses is the king of water, and it dissolves stone. He's the master of water. Well, what happens when you...
I'm looking forward to him getting done with Exodus. This sounds very, very interesting.
Lose the adaptation. Well, the tyranny disappears. Hooray! But then where are you? Well, you're in this terrible space between adaptations. You're in a space between adaptations. That's the desert.
The space between adaptations.
Yes,
we in evolution.
And again, now notice in this telling that the agent in the story is God. But in our modern renditions, it's like this is the character we keep dropping.
We call it the adaptive valley. And you're very right that a desert is a perfect analog for the adaptive valley. It is not a productive place. It is some place one must cross. And frankly, it has the same problem as the adaptive valley on the evolutionary landscape.
But of course, God brings manna and feeds his people in the desert. He brings life to the place where there is no life. He brings transformation. He actually causes them to die. Israel in the desert dies and is reborn in the desert. We'll see if Peterson pulls that theme out. But this is very exciting, and I look forward to this. I am out of time right now, so I have to bring this video to an end. After 5 tries, and that is very unusual for me, I very seldom throw anything away, think I have something. I know I have something that I'm going to publish. So this will come out tomorrow. There's, like with all of my videos, there's a lot of loose ends in here, and I'm not done with the critical drinker. There's some other elements I want to bring in. I want to spend a little bit more time with the hero's journey and I especially want to talk about that part that Northrop Frye mentioned, that it's interesting in this biblical shape, the villain in many ways is interesting. And I think, again, this is I think there is a difference in that, because especially in the Old Testament, where you don't have the devil per se, you get the adversary in the book of Job, but you don't have the devil per se as you have in the Gospels, that the God of Israel is the main character of the story. That's just true of the Bible. Anyway, let me know what you think of this video, and yeah, I'll be very interested to see what you think.